during this pandemic. It's been such a wonderful opportunity and really just blessing to be able to get outside and to enjoy these ancestral lands that Royal Roads is resting upon. And so it really has been important for me, just in terms of my own well-being. So I'm sure that people feel the same way wherever they're at. Getting outside has been a really important thing over the last year. I'm just going to introduce Olaolu, Adeleye. Did I get it, Olaolu? I've been practicing. Close. Is an associate faculty member with the School of Communication and Culture. He has a passion for human rights and children's rights and intercultural communication, informed by his studies in international development and in working with global organizations. And as an associate faculty member, Olaolu translates his international experiences into engaging approaches to social development issues. And thank you, Olaolu, for moderating today's session. And I should also mention that Olaolu was a co-contributor to the Anti-Racism Task Force. So as moderator, he'll introduce the panelists, and he'll be the one moderating the session, and I will go off camera. So thank you again to the panelists for coming in today, and thank you, Olaolu, for moderating this, and I really look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Remillard. It's an honor to be a part of this inaugural conference, and an honor to share the space with our guests today, who we will speak to, and I will really just facilitate this engagement. I just wanted to say, even as I have been able to listen to some of the other participants and the other presenters, that it has been great to see the myriad of topics which have been highlighted. And this one is one which, like the others, is very interdisciplinary. It touches on all different aspects and spheres of our society. So our objective today is to be able to learn about what this concept, what these themes mean within the context of our Royal Roads community. And you'll have an opportunity to hear from each of our panelists on their perspectives of this. We're here because communication matters. We're here because representation matters. We are here because, as communications practitioners, experts, theorists, our responsibility is to make that which is esoteric into something which is tangible for people to be able to digest, to make it palatable. And so even as we look at what anti-racism has meant societally, but more specifically here at Royal Roads, we ask you to engage with us and to do so in a manner which is respectful. I will not be monitoring the chat over the course of our conversation, but at the end of our session, we will offer an opportunity for you to pose any questions that you have to our panelists. And so with that, I will begin by actually asking each of our panelists to give us their account of how they are connected to our Royal Roads community. I will start with President Steenkamp, and then we'll go to Dr. Athena Madan, Alessandra, and then Juli Holloway.
Well, thank you very much. And I really want to thank you for the invitation to be part of this important discussion today. I'm joining you today from the campus of Royal Roads University. As has been already acknowledged, the campus sits on the lands of the Kasapsan and Lekwungen peoples who have lived on these lands for thousands of years. And we are truly privileged to be able to join in partnership with those communities as we learn and live and work on these lands. I'm the president and vice chancellor of the university, and I've been here for just over 2 years now, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion today, so thank you.
Dr. Madan.
Hi there. Thank you, Olaolu, for this introduction, or for the invitation to be here. And I'm joining and dialing in to you today from the lands of the Songhees Nations. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak today for my involvement in the Anti-Racism Task Force, which has we have just dissolved the task force, but I'm happy to speak to you about the lessons that we learned. And as co-chair of the task force, I am also associate faculty within the School of Humanitarian Studies. So I look at issues of ethics, not necessarily communications, but just implementation. So I'll pass the speaking baton over to, would you like Alessandra? Thanks.
Hi, Thank you. So I'm Alessandra Vinhas. I am a student almost finishing the Master in Intercultural and International Communication, ex-student of Olaolu. And I'm talking also from the Songi territory. My kids share with their kids the same schools here in this area. And I'm very grateful to be here. And I was part of the anti-race task force as a research assistant. That it was a valuable opportunity. Thank you for that. And I'm a Brazilian diplomat, and I'm on a leave from my career to do this master here. Thank you. Julie?
Hello, good morning. I'm Juli Holloway. I'm an alum from the Master in Arts in Professional Communication. I just finished my thesis on the role of communications in First Nations community decision-making and the power of communications to be able to advance self-determination. I'm currently the Director of Communications and Engagement at the BC First Nations Justice Council. But prior to this, I started this job in January. I served as the Associate Director of Strategic Communications at TRU. So have experiences of working on campuses and also being a student on campuses, and pleased to be a part of this discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you all for that. It's important for us to understand our positionality even as we delve into our topics today, so that you have context for which or from which each of these responses come from. So we'll begin with this conversation about race, racism, and anti-racism. Stuart Hall talks about race as a floating signifier. And so in different contexts, it can mean different things. And over history and in different societies, it is used as a way to either uphold certain values or to disenfranchise different groups. And so we look at Railroad specifically because it is a truly multicultural campus. And with that diversity, with that plurality, the topic of race is one which comes to the forefront. So to my panelists today, my question to you is, what has been your experience with this concept of racism, and why, to that end, is anti-racism important? What does that mean to you? We'll start with President Steenkamp.
Thank you, Olaolu. I was born in Botswana in Africa, and you know, obviously being born white in Africa, you come from a certain history, and my family, my father's family, had probably 300 years of kind of settler history in Africa, with all of the challenges that brings with it. My immediate family, my parents, were very actively involved in the anti-apartheid movement. You know, apartheid, of course, was entrenched in South Africa next door to Botswana. So I was lucky that I was brought up with those values. And I often wonder, if I hadn't been born into a family like that, if I'd been born into a family which was very supportive of racist structures, how might that have informed my life and my views? So notwithstanding that, you know, I grew up in a family which was not racist and which fought apartheid, you still experience white privilege, you know, because you are white in that context. And there still are racist stereotypes, racist tropes, racist ways of thinking that you absorb. And it's been a really important kind of learning experience for me over the last few years, to really think about that background and that history and what that meant. And I came to Canada as an international student to study history, and I was studying African history. I was really prompted to study African history because of the kind of history we were taught at school, which was largely a history of white triumphalism in Africa. And I really wanted to look at African history and African resistance to colonialism. And I learned a lot through that path, and I'm still learning through that journey. But coming to Canada, of course, you make certain assumptions that you're not going to encounter the kind of racism that you've left behind in Africa. And very quickly I came to understand, and in fact through my research came to understand that racism was deeply embedded in Canadian society. And in fact, systems of segregation and apartheid often took inspiration from what had occurred in the Canadian context, with the setting up of reserves for so-called Indians as well. And so then you begin to sort of delve under the kind of veneer of Canadian society and understand, the long history of racism here as well. Racism against the Chinese, of course, the ongoing racism against Indigenous populations, against populations who arrived who were not part of a kind of Anglo-Saxon majority, the racism towards the Irish and the Italians in earlier days. And then, of course, the racism that we've seen, and we see that is continually expressed in Canada. And you learn more about the history. You learn about the history of race rights. You learn about Africville. You learn about Hogan's Alley. You learn about early settlements, which have now been forgotten, and all of that. So for me as a historian, I just think it is so important to be able to uncover those histories and hear those voices and give voice to people who continue to have lived experience of racism in this country. And this month is, of course, Black History Month. And I think it's been, it's been a revelation to many people, this Black History Month in this year as well. I think we've had much more exposure, perhaps, in an interesting way, because we are connecting virtually. So that's just some of my own personal journey, and in my role as an institutional leader here now, I think it's absolutely critical that we pursue an active anti-racist strategy. And Athena, I know, will talk to the anti-racism task force, but for me, there are just a few things that I really try and follow. And the first is really to listen more and to speak less, really to listen to people who have lived experience of discrimination and racism, and invite those uncomfortable conversations as well. The second, which I've spoken about a bit, is really to educate yourself about racism, your role in systemic racism, and also understand why, for instance, protests are occurring. Tap into the really excellent resources out there, and there are so many good resources, and don't rely on racialized people to educate you. Take the time to educate yourself. As well, in an institutional context, really to understand what unconscious bias looks like and microaggressions. Because a lot of racism in our context is quite subtle, or is more institutional and embedded than it is explicit, although there is explicit racism as well. And then really to champion equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, institutionally, but in your community as well. And of course, then there's political engagement, which I think is absolutely key. And lastly, and this is a really challenging one, is to speak out against racism in conversations in your everyday life. And that includes with your family and your coworkers and your friends. And this is often a very difficult thing to do, but if you are silent, you really are complicit in this as well. And I find, for me, that's almost one of the biggest challenges that I have. I mean, how do you speak out in a way in which you're not calling people out, but you're really calling them in? And it's a constructive conversation, and you're not shutting things down. And that's a constant journey, and it's a constant exploration. So I'll leave my comments there, but thank you for the question.
I'll then go to Alessandra, Juli, and then we'll round up this question with Dr.
Madan. Well, for me, anti-racism is taking action. It's not enough not only being racist. I've lived in 5 different countries: Peru, Panama, Australia, Canada, Portugal. I have witnessed systemic racism in all of them. So in a way, even if it's not on the media out there that there is racism in Canada, it was not a surprise because it's not something that only happens here. And in each country, I was in a different position. In Brazil, I am white. In Portugal, I was Brazilian with a lot of prejudice against it. And here in Canada, I discovered myself brown. And from a position of privilege already, because I am doing a master here at the university. So I don't encounter the same amount of racism that other people can encounter, but it was really a good discovery, like to be proud. If being Brazilian here is to be brown, I am proud to be brown. And I think that Royal Roads is not an island. I think that some weeks ago, President Steenkamp cut the wires in order to open the campus to people from outside. And I think that what we discuss here should also go outside the campus. So I think that anti-racism here in Victoria, in Langford, it's to go out there. It's to make this community a more comfortable place for all our students that come from many different countries. And I think that we are in a special moment. There is still a lot to be done, but I'm happy to study about reconciliation and seeing how much have been done here in comparison to other places. And I also think that we are in a momentum of a lot of people getting more conscious about racism. And I think that Black Lives Matter only happened because there is this increase of conscience among Black and white people as well. And I think that we need to take advantage of this momentum. And even if there is backlash, let's continue giving steps forward. Thank you.
For me, I think being anti-racist means taking an active stance. I echo some of the thoughts that have already been shared. I think it's really important to remember, I know for myself and my own experiences working or being a student at Royal Roads or working at another campus, it can be easy to forget that racialized people do live a racialized experience, and where you might have good colleagues or good counterparts, to know that sometimes, like when they leave the campus where they feel very safe, that they still experience racism in their daily lives. And it might not be something that you would ever talk about in the context of conversations you have, but so to be cognizant that that still does happen, that when we walk off campus, that we do continue to experience interactions that are racist. And I think some of the most obvious forms of racism, the most direct, are of course it's easy for you to point out and say that that's not okay, that people are treated like that. But some of the other things that have already been discussed, the microaggressions and the systemic, the biases are really the ones that we don't often talk about. And when you have privilege, it's hard to see those things. And so it takes having conversations about sometimes how the systems work or don't work for racialized people, and you don't really see them until you have those conversations. So it's really important to have those conversations and to listen, but to also work on building trust with these communities so that they do feel comfortable enough that we have psychological safety, where we're able to share those experiences in a way that feels good, in a way that we can move forward productively together. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, Alessandra, and President Steenkamp. I echo and appreciate the thoughts and the experiences that you shared. And I resonated a lot with, or I appreciated President Steenkamp hearing your personal journey, which I knew some of, but I didn't know the totality of what you expressed. And I appreciate that, I think, because to me, when I think of what anti-racism means, for those who want an intellectual theorized or expect a theorized intellectual deconstruction from me as a faculty, I'm just going to be touchy-feely for a minute and talk about the emotional experience of racism. To me, it's a personal journey, it's a personal experience, and it's an intergenerational one. So it's an inheritance that I have also had from my parents and ancestors. My work is all about having conversations and making space and helping voices coexist side by side. My work intersects with my intersectionalities. I'm a naturalized Canadian citizen born in the Philippines, tribal Filipino indigenous cultures, and I'm post-partition Indian. So just the backdrop of my inheritance there's always been like a backdrop of racism, of division and racial tensions as a result of how I grew up. My ancestral traditions, cultures, and worldviews are embedded in my day-to-day practices and relationships, and I acknowledge that at times that's not necessarily part of the dominant. So also on another level, I'm a mother to a biracial son in a society that I perceive does little to motivate or socialize men for acts of kindness. So my own family's genealogies comprise a complex narrative wherein our immediate family represents, I know that Alessandra talked about places where she has lived, and I've also been thinking about what racism means to me from a perspective of where I have lived in societies where I've been participants in. My immediate family represents 4 citizenships, 10 languages, 3 faiths, and 7 siblings. So there's just a lot of complicated history in my own personal inheritance that plays out in what I think racism means and the action that needs to happen for anti-racism to take shape. So in Victoria and Langford, it's a very different environment than, say, Toronto, where I spent much of my adult years. And in 2021, it's different now than it was in 1990, when I first learned about apartheid coming down in South Africa. But we still have a ways to go. So anti-racist action, or anti-racism, as one of our other teaching and one of our other research assistants stated, and I've been thinking about her statement or her definition of racism, and I think I'd like to adopt that, is recognizing racism in all of its forms and learning how to combat racism in all its forms, including in ourselves. So to me, anti-racism is a reflective journey. It's an intergenerational journey. It's an interrelational journey, and it's continuing. So at Royal Roads, I have been very fortunate to be part of the task force where we are having these conversations today, and hopefully in spaces and places to come. So yeah, I'll close my thoughts there, and back to you, Olaolu. Thank you.
Thank you all for that. It's important to even just hear, the intersectionality as you've highlighted, and the fact that this is intergenerational. And even, for yourself, President Steenkamp, speaking to your experience, just because of the fact that somebody may see you initially and think that your experience may be such, this backstory of your history, your family history, these things are important to consider. I want to ask a second question, even as we think about and speak to this anti-racism task force that was built and really championed by yourself, President Steenkamp. My question to you specifically is, what was the impetus, what was the motivation for this to occur? And to Alessandra and Dr. Madan, who were part of the anti-racism task force, maybe speak to some of the key learnings. Each of you have kind of already highlighted the fact that racism can't be quantified. Sometimes it's one of these things that, especially when we talk about microaggressions. So maybe you can speak to the value of what you learned in your process of engaging students, staff, and our community, as well as the value maybe of these qualitative accounts that you collated.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that question. So the murder of George Floyd in the summer, I think, shook us all, obviously, and it triggered movements around racial justice, the likes of which many of us haven't seen. I think some people would say not since the civil rights movement has there been such a broad consciousness of racial justice issues, not only here in North America but also around the world. And it was a profoundly shocking moment for many people. You think about, I think previously about all the grief that Colin Kaepernick had when he took the knee at those games. And you think about that lonely statement for so long, and people sort of dismissing the importance and the significance of what he was doing while professing a general support for anti-racism. And then you see what happened to George Floyd, which happens to people each and every day, but it was so publicly and so graphically displayed. And it triggered, of course, emotions in all of us. I mean, here at Raw Roads, following that incident, we set up a public anonymous Padlet, which was a virtual sort of forum for people to talk about their experiences and their emotions. And there was a very strong response within the first few days of that being set up, and a real call for action. And at the same time, I think we saw, across the country, and certainly at pretty much every university and college, presidents posting statements of support and support of anti-racism, and the shock and horror that we all felt around George Floyd. But the challenge with those kinds of statements is that they often posted because people are just reacting to what's happening in the community. And I don't want to be unkind when I say this, but often they are posted with a view to, we've responded and we've dealt with that, and it will blow over, and then there'll be some other crisis down the road and we'll post another statement. And it's a kind of virtue signaling in a way which I think people are just tired of. And there was a real demand, and I could feel this demand, and I felt it in myself, for us to take action here. And so that really was the impetus for the Anti-Racism Task Force, is really not to study this issue anymore. We kind of know about this, but what do we need to do as a community? What actions do we need to take? What practical steps do we need to take? How do we actually get moving on this? And so for that reason, I did ask 4 core members to get together and come up with the concept of a task force, which later expanded into 17 people. And I must say they did remarkable work. I mean, we have a blueprint now of action, some of it very challenging, which it should be, some of it aspirational. But this is something, I think, which will help guide us as we kind of navigate our way, forward to deal with these really, really significant issues. So for me, it was really important to demonstrate commitment and action on this front. I mean, we do have equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. We have a diversity action group, but we didn't really have this real focus on anti-racism and the set of actions which we needed in order to make significant progress on these issues. And what I really appreciated about the task force, and this will be my last comment, is the way in which they so skillfully and kind of delicately navigated the terrain here. Because of course, Indigenous people, as an example, have been dealing with racism in this country, for generations. And this was not to suggest in any way that our commitment to reconciliation and to dealing with that fact of systemic discrimination against Indigenous people was somehow less important. It's equally important. These issues we need to work on these issues together and collaboratively. And I think the Anti-Racism Task Force did an amazing job in sort of bringing together all of these pieces and all of these commitments. So thank you. And over to, who would you like to go next?
Let's get Athena to speak.
Athena, please.
You can speak a bit about the approach and the philosophy for the research.
Okay, thank you both. Olaolu asked me to share a little bit about the methodology, how people were formed, and President Steenkamp mentioned that from our core 4 from our core 3, we expanded to 17, which I think no one necessarily anticipated. So the movement, it did very much, the idea became very much a movement by interested key actors. I'll go ahead, if I may, just to share my screen so you have something to look at that is not me. There's a little bit of a presentation that I have that I'd like to just share my screen with you. When we presented our action plan to the executive, it's useful probably to know where we got the data that we'll be speaking to in a few minutes about the plan. So as you know, we were appointed by President Steenkamp. We grew to a number of, we grew to 17 people. We had 10 people across different departments of the university, all in strategic areas where they have intersections and relationships with students as well as staff who are interested in organizational change or just leadership for change. And then we also hired, initially we were going to hire 2 students, but upon the interviews, they were all just great and they had skill sets and interests that we realized could really help. We could leverage skill sets and interests to really broaden our reach and to communicate key messages with more impact. So we hired 5 instead of 2. And then we had other people wander in as volunteers saying, as alumni or just people in the Victoria broader community who are engaged in anti-racist efforts who wanted to also join with us. So then we became 17. And the data, if we do get to granular detail about what some of the recommendations are, we, just so you know, we held 6 focus groups, distributed online surveys in the month of December. And then in January, we held 3 iterative feedback loops to the members of the community or whoever was interested and collected anonymous Padlet feedback. So I think tallying up all of these numbers, we had just under, and then individual consultations for people who had other experiences and wanted to go in greater detail about what their recommendations were. We had just under 200 people provide their direct feedback into what the plan points were. So as far as that's where the data came from, and as far as how we operationalized, we were very participatory to the degree where things took a long time to move forward. And maybe Alessandra can speak more to that throughout the process and lessons learned. And I think it's also worth saying for the students who were hired, and again, Alessandra can speak to this, I heard surprise sometimes expressed because what they thought they signed up for with respect to research and communications ended up not being research in their mind. It's very much participatory research and research production, but it wasn't looking at data in the way that they were used to or had been trained or expected to look at. So, and we'll speak to probably some of those as far as how people view or take up particular forms of language to communicate their messages and communicating with diverse actors and stakeholders. Those are all lessons that we had to learn along the way in a participatory way. And yeah, sometimes it just, the methodology of participation was very much realized within the forum and the meeting structure of the task force to the point where we heard from people, we tried to satisfy as many perspectives and viewpoints that we could along the way. And when decisions had to be made that were divergent, at the very least, there was compromise and dialogue along the way to make that happen. So does that speak, Olaolu, to the methodology that you're hoping to raise? I realize I'm just also kind of maybe some of the questions you wanted to bring along to Alessandra.
I think that's great. And there will perhaps be some other questions from our attendees. Alessandra, if you could speak maybe a bit more specifically to some of the learnings. Dr. Madan spoke about some of the individual revelations, if you will, that occurred in that process. And you've already highlighted some, speaking about the difference of your experience in different global locales. Could you speak more about some of the language that personally made you reflect and reconsider some of the perspectives you had going into this process?
Yeah, well, I've learned that language in this subject is very complicated between BIPOC, IBPOC, racialized people, and it's because it's difficult to find you within those languages. So for me, was discovering myself a BIPOC was particularly complicated because I was in a position that I knew when I checked that box. Are you that box? Are you a BIPOC? In this case, it was affirmative action, and because we need more racialized people inside the task force. And I was kind of think of myself, in Brazil, I am white. If can I, in the very first moment that I see that box put that I am a BIPOC, and I will take advantage of being a BIPOC. So it was really complicated. I need to go back and talk with Black friends in Brazil about the subject. And I think that I only kind of accepted that I am brown in this country with their blessing, like, no, you are brown there. Okay, so I can be a BIPOC here. It was an interesting moment of self-reflection for me. But from the task force, Athena is right. I was one of the person that thought that to be a research assistant would be a different thing. But on the other way around, one of the courses that I loved most in my master was communication for social change. And within communication for social change, what I liked most is the participatory approach. And in the end, the task force was exactly that. No, we were listening to the community. When we think about the participatory approach and communication for social change, normally most of the examples are from the Global South, or in Canada, the method used with indigenous community. So it was very interesting to see that inside the university. And I was very happy and very privileged to be in a place that I could hear to all those different voices from students, staff, alumni, faculty. And I think that the anti-racism action plan is very challenging because it really reflects a huge variety of ways of seeing what anti-racism should be on campus. And it was what I want. It's for the people that read the action plan to be sure that there is so many things there, because it voices of so many different people.
Olaolu, can I just quickly add to Alessandra's comments? Thank you. So I realize also some of the learning specific to perhaps people who are gathered here to learn about communications. Some of the key surprisings or learnings that we had also were, as Alessandra was saying, just the perceptions of who belongs to be on the, who has the right to be on the task force, and who has the right to talk about racism, who has the right to facilitate conversations about racism, and when conversations are facilitated, how much space does the facilitator have to be able to speak? These are all things that were in some respects, the people who facilitated the focus groups, or the students who focused the students who facilitated the focus groups, and then even just conversations we had about disseminating communication, how to talk about racism within the group to the public. There were just so many feelings and so many perceptions and so many different approaches that we learned along the way. So even if we are focusing on an anti-racist approach, as President Steenkamp said, this is also part of our reconciliation commitments, both at Royal Roads, but as in the Canadian landscape. And within indigeneity, or within Indigenous approaches, there's a certain amount of wanting to meet people where they are so that we can move forward together. That was also very important for us to take as an approach. But then there were people who were more on the activist side of anti-racism, who really wanted to proverbially storm the castle, look at very activist ways of dismantling structures of power. And so we also had to engage those voices and those perspectives and make sure that what they felt were reasonable incremental processes of change could also be reflected in what we were proposing to move forward. So there was a certain amount of navigating to satisfy diverse key actors, including names about how they chose to identify and call themselves. So for example, one person in a focus group had very strong feelings, which we adopted as a task force. Instead of being called stakeholders, which reflects a certain amount of holding of power and colonial holding of power, they preferred to be called key actors, who then were recognized as having equal influence and power in order to shape the plan as we move forward. That's one easy example about how we were able to satisfy that engagement. But then we have more ongoing conversations about terminology. For example, how people identify within the BIPOC designator. People felt like BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, and Peoples of Color acronym, was also a term that erased people's experiences or lumped people together in a way that was homogenous and therefore not respectful of their own identities and diversities and intersectionalities within those identities. So we then decided to just stick with the term racialized people or racialized peoples, and thus make sure that the term was more inclusive than the designator of BIPOC or BIPOC. We also found that when we were talking about issues of representation, pictures, for example, in a communications document, where you have space for one person or one aspect of a community's experience, it therefore excluded other communities. So which community or whose faces had space in our communications plan document, we opted to actually have no pictures. So therefore the content was actually just the plan and not the representation of people contributing to that plan. And then approaches, I think I've covered it. We still also have grappled along the way of, and I'm sure that as we move forward with talking about the implementation of the action plan, who has the right to speak, who has the right to take up particular courses of action, that was just a contested conversation along the way, and I expect or anticipate that it will continue to be. And then last, we also have people who don't identify within any racialized community, who feel left out in this conversation, who felt decentralized and excluded from the process. And so also trying to so for example, white people, white males specifically, felt that they were excluded from this process. And given that they were typically in a position to be able to lead and tell people what they knew, the ask for behavioral change to listen to what other people know created a certain amount of conflict. And for it put the impetus on the task force or people within their own communities who are racialized to state what the importance was for these conversations, which also had a certain amount of emotional residue and impact that some of the students and some of the members of the task force were asked to carry. And I expect again that will continue through any continued anti-racist action, not necessarily just at the Royal Roads campus, but throughout society as well. So just to circle back and express appreciation for President Steenkamp's remarks in this is a reflective process and it requires ongoing learning. As ongoing learning and ongoing reflection for us to be able to all learn together as we implement these plans. That's not necessarily a surprise, but the degree to which we experienced it was a surprise. So those, thank you, Olaolu. Those are the key points that I forgot to mention.
Thank you, Dr. Madan. Some great points, even as we speak about who has the right to speak, who has the right to have their perspectives reflected. Bakhtin talks about this idea of a dialogic encounter in which we flip this space where people who hold positions, hegemonic positions of power, then actually have their perspectives challenged. And so even as we think about what that means, when we speak about anti-racism at RRU, we're talking about curriculum, we're talking about our community, we're talking about within the classroom. Each of these spaces have created dynamics that have created structures which we have acknowledged and we are working with and against in order to create the opportunity for voices to be heard. Thusu talks about this idea of imperialist epistemology, this projection of an approach which resembles colonial approaches to not only learning, but to life. So this question to Juli first. As we consider divergent and convergent voices, how do we create spaces that allow for these to coexist and or to be supported in these discussions?
Thank you. I think I mean, it's important to remember that that our lived experiences inform our worldviews, and so making sure that there's, I think there's sometimes a tendency where we're trying to gather divergent voices, but we're kind of leaning on the same people that we've already had interactions with or that we've worked with on other initiatives. So really challenging ourselves to even continue to diversify the people that we're bringing to the table. And I'm also certainly aware that when I'm speaking and I say that that my opinion doesn't reflect every Indigenous person's opinion, is just my perspective based on the experiences that I've had. So I don't ever want to speak for anybody else. I don't ever want to center the conversation on myself. It's about centering the conversation on the issues and bringing people along. So in terms of how do we create those spaces is really just thinking through the people that we're engaging in the conversation, and are we creating an environment where people can trust that their opinion, that their voice is being heard. And it might be where we're not able to take action on every single thought or opinion or idea that people have, but just giving people that space. And sometimes it's hard to even think about what you might say in a conversation when people are asking questions of you. And I have found that to be exhausting at times, where when you're the only Indigenous person in the room, people have questions, and when you're developing relationships and you might be the first, I might be the first Indigenous person they've met, and that's their opportunity to learn. And so that was one thing that I didn't really, when I first started working on campus, or I didn't, to be the only Indigenous person in the room and to have people ask questions, I don't always have all of the answers. And so that can be tiring. And when I remember when the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women report came out, I had a lot of people reach out to me and make sure I was okay. And I didn't even expect that. And it was just even overwhelming too, it's tricky. It's so difficult. And none of us know what it's like to live in a decolonized Canada. So we're all figuring it out together, and we're gonna make mistakes as we learn what it's like to kind of move forward in a direction that we've never gone before.
I really appreciate that. None of us know what it is like to live in a decolonized Canada. And, even your point about this monolith, this idea that, oh, that's the Indigenous voice, so they are the person who we go to for everything. Or that's the Black voice, so that's the person who we go to for everything. Very, very important. I'm going to pose the same question to Alessandra, and then we'll shift to another question.
Yeah, I really like to hear Julie, and difficult to talk about after you. But I think that to create a space for divergent voices, in the end, is to create multiple small spaces and constantly. It's not that we can change everything at once. So I think that we need to try to find, like, everybody has the right to speak from your own perspective and not try to speak for others. And everybody should listen in a way respectfully of what the people are saying. But I know that there are many things that can be very triggering, and I know that it can be exhaustive to all the time be answering questions. So I think that we should try to see where we can help more. So if in Brazil, I am a white person and I can understand where people with white fragility feel, let be me to speak with those people about that, because I can completely understand that a Black person want to deal with different things and not about white fragility. But I really need that we need more and more spaces. One of the things that for me was very interesting, it's in my cohort, we are 35 international students. And sometimes it surprised me to hear, for example, a Black student with a discourse that in Brazil, it would come from white people that want to maintain the status quo. So a Black student talking about meritocracy and saying that you need to work hard and you will get there. And on the other way around, to discuss in our WhatsApp group here, and a brown student saying that she doesn't like this thing of racialized people, or of coloring, because we are all human beings. And again, this is the kind of discourse that in Brazil would come from people that don't want the status quo to change. So we have so much different voices, and if people don't feel comfortable to talk, we can't advance. So yeah, I think that we need to create a space in every place that we can, without losing the focus, but we can have small talks in WhatsApp groups and in classrooms and in the cafeteria while having lunch, and respectfully listen to one another.
Thank you, Alessandra. We're going to shift to our final formal question, and then we'll shift into taking questions from our audience. We're here at a communications conference, and obviously we've talked about this within the context of communication ethics, but there are many ethical considerations even within this ethical topic. What is the role and the responsibility of communication in contributing to an anti-racist campus and to an anti-racist approach within our RRU community? How do we consider the fact, yesterday Dr. Remillard spoke about this idea that we live in a society now that focuses more on really the sensationalism of information. So we're not there so much for information, but we're there actually for the things which are drawing the attention of people. So what is our imperative? What is our approach? Do we need to express things in an implicit or explicit way? And what is that role, and what does that mean as a professional communicator, as a president, as a faculty member? I'm going to actually ask Juli to start, then President Steenkamp, Dr. Madan, and then Alessandra.
Thank you. I think going back to my earlier comment, I think the biggest thing, or the best thing that communicators can do, is realize that racialized people do this free education, or that we do encounter these things, and help us by like supporting us and help carrying that load. And so when I think about communications that might go out, or that I've seen go out about Indigenous or other racialized like events, or maybe there might be a word of the day in the local language, or there's territorial acknowledgements. And I would encourage everybody to think about how we can go deeper than that, how we can talk about the ways that we would dismantle stereotypes or those microaggressions and address those directly. And I might say an example that I've seen on campuses that myself is where I've heard somebody say something like, oh, I'm the lowest man on the totem pole, or we should have a powwow about that. It's really hard to react in a way, like to create a teachable moment around that myself. And that's kind of support from communications around what things like that are said, or those stereotypes that are so ingrained, and just challenging people to reflect on those. I would just say go deeper than just the sharing of events and knowledge, like really trying to engage people in conversations and tell stories that speak to the anti-racist culture that we're trying to collectively build, shine a spotlight on those behaviors that already exist on campus, and just building in that education around some of those larger issues. Because I find that there's so many the events or things that we can participate in, but when you get busy in your own day-to-day, it's easy to kind of just dismiss those and just not really pay attention to those. So I think the role that communicators can play is just taking that next step and having a more substantive conversation and helping to drive that conversation.
Before I pass it over to President Steenkamp, one last thought from you. What are the best modes of communication, do you feel, to get that messaging?
I think it would really depend on what's working already on campus. What are the opportunities? Where are those places that people go for information? Is it the intranet? Do you have a newsletter? Are those places where you can just build in pockets of reflective moments? I think we've talked a little bit about reflection, and I think just getting people more to reflect on what's working and what's not working in a way that doesn't feel so beating you on the head with it. Just like those little stories, I think would help, and just keeping that conversation going through the channels that already exist.
Thank you, Julie. President Steenkamp.
Thanks, Julie. Julie's expressed that so well, and I would just agree with her that you use all the channels you can to communicate these issues. So that's in your statements, your videos, your social media channels. You constantly need to return to these themes and keep emphasizing them. One of the themes in the Anti-Racism Task Force report was building space, place, and connection. And I think there were a lot of interesting recommendations there, because communication is not only the kind of traditional mechanism of a statement or a social media channel. It's how you present to your community and to the world generally. And we have a particular challenge here at Roa Roads, where we are sitting here in essentially a colonial estate with its centerpiece, a castle, with all of the baggage that entails. And yet we know that these are indigenous lands with a long continuous indigenous history here. So when we tell the story of this place, we have to tell a story which weaves these pieces together. The indigenous story is not just the first piece. The indigenous story continues. It is continuous. Then there is a colonial period, and then there's a military period, and now there's a public university period, but there's a continuous indigenous story. And I think we're just coming to terms with how to tell that story and how to express that reality on campus. We have a program across campus to sort of start decolonizing the look and feel of this place. And, at times these initiatives are dismissed as just being symbolic, but indigenous representation visually is really important. But you have to be mindful about it as well, and you have to take advice and guidance from indigenous communities. And we have a group of elders and old ones who guide us. I've heard a lot of staff and faculty say to me, for instance, we should have indigenous names for all of our buildings and our roads and things like that. And when I was at UBC, I worked very closely with the Musqueam over a number of years to introduce indigenous naming throughout the campus. But it was a very mindful process, and it wasn't a process of translating English names into indigenous names. It was actually giving, for instance, roads and streets proper indigenous names. So, West Mall wasn't translated as West Mall. It was the road which points to the mountains, or the path which points to the mountains. So here at Roa Roads, I think we just have to take our advice and take our time to do these things properly, rather than just rush into it because we think it's a way of demonstrating that we are woke in this sense, right? So there are a whole bunch of ways of communicating. Just one last little story. We had an incident on campus, which many of you will be aware of, a few weeks ago, where we had racist graffiti sprayed on some trees in the forest surrounding the campus. A set of swastikas and some racial slurs. And members of the public came upon these. It became a kind of media story. And we as a community have come together to talk about that and how we respond to that. And we had a cleansing ceremony in the forest with Indigenous elders, and it was a wonderful way of Indigenous culture coming to support us in dealing with an issue like that. And yet I feel very ambivalent about the communication around those issues, because we also know that those kinds of people feed on publicity, and I've seen this in other contexts. So I think it's always really important to have the discussion with the people who are affected by these issues, and to take advice and really to think carefully about how you manage these things in this kind of hyper sensationalist environment with, you know, social media as well can just amp things up in a remarkable way, and in which you don't want to subject your community to alt-right attacks, as an example, or to make people targets. But on the other hand, you also want to confront racism whenever and wherever you see it, and not be under any illusion that it doesn't exist in our immediate community, because it does. So I'll just leave it there and pass it on to Athena. Thanks.
Thank you. I would just like to add then, for the comments that have already been made, the role of communications to contributing to an anti-racist campus and to an anti-racist community, I think is about the stories. I think I showed you that slide where the data came from, and I know it was a boring slide, but people, at least the audiences that we have spoke to, have expressed they wanted to know where the data came from and how many numbers represented the opinions that formed the 5 themes of the action plan and the 122 recommendation points, because it requires a certain amount of change, and some of it is practical, some of the changes is strategic or actionable, and some of the recommendations are not actionable within our, it just takes time, it'll take some generations. That's all by intention, and that's all by design. And so for those people who may need data, who may need to understand where the stories are coming from, the context of those stories that are coming from, one of the surprises that we learned was that those critics felt like 200 voices was not sufficient of a sample size to really determine the impact of why we are stating these changes are urgent. So to demonstrate the urgency for people who may be resistant to change, I think the role of communications can be to communicate those stories, to capture the hearts and minds, to engage in personal will to listen to maybe more stories, or to have more conversations, or to reflect on, oh, what does the history of Canada really mean to the perspective of someone who I had not heard from, or whose perspectives I had not been exposed to before. So I think the role of communications can be to communicate what those experiences are in a respectful and meaningful way. I'll pass the baton over to Alessandra.
I just remember that in my class yesterday, Barb, my professor, put a quote that was, when you are used to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And what I think, like, to be an ethical communicator, you will need to be used of feeling discomfort. It's like when you are putting for the first time a contact lens and it will be strange in your eyes. We need to put this filter in front of our eyes, and it's not comfortable. And if it's too comfortable, it's because you are not feeling well. So when I saw one of the questions here, that like how to be a communication structure and to teach about that without triggering others in a way that you are not skilled to facilitate, I think that my 2 cents, it's you will never feel completely skilled to facilitate. Maybe it will always be uncomfortable, and we will be afraid when we are talking and dealing with that, but we need to get used with this discomfort.
Thank you, Alessandra. And yes, maybe that is the actual point. Maybe we are supposed to lean into that discomfort. Thank you to each of our panelists. We're going to take some of the questions here. I'm going to pass the mic over to Dr. Remillard, and he will pose a few questions to the panel, and then we will close with some final comments.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'll be just asking some questions that have come in the chat from the beginning. Alessandra, you sort of mentioned one question that came in, and maybe we can, just since you've brought that one up, we could turn it over to any of the other panelists that maybe wanted to speak to that, which is, which was the question, where is it now? the question about how do you, as a communication instructor, and this came in from Sarah, as a communication instructor, I would welcome your ideas on how to build healthy conversations about these topics into my class when, one, it's not explicitly part of the learning outcomes, and two, it doesn't trigger others in a way that I'm not skilled to facilitate. I just open it up to whoever.
I suppose as someone who instructs, I'll take that baton first, and then Juli, Alessandra, President Steenkamp, if you'd like to add in, please do. I'd also like to possibly lump my comments in to answer part of the question for Mel O, who asked basically, how do you teach anti-racism to non-interested academics? And I can speak to that because I have experience with this for both of these questions. So first, one, I think the action plan does have a theme that looks at, I don't have the title in front of me, but it looks at transforming research and curriculum, which will have recommendations to build up resources for instructors at Royal Roads. So pay attention or stay tuned for that. Second, I think to answer the question that just came in for the second question from Sarah, with respect to learning outcomes, I think we need to change our learning outcomes to include this as an intentional outcome. And then I'm also aware that this is probably a conversation that won't be answered in the few minutes that we have, but I'm happy to continue this conversation offline for those people who are interested, if Olaolu would like to facilitate that, but also stay tuned and be aware that these are conversations that you're not having alone. A bunch of faculty and instructors would like more resources at Royal Roads to be able to implement and effectuate these types of changes. And I apologize because I have my little toddler who's, oh, thank you, who's giving me some mail. Thank you. We also have, I mean, with my own pedagogies, I also think it's modeled from your own personal experience, and it's grounded by who you are and where you are from. So for me, I include Black, Brown, and Indigenous voices throughout my course reading lists. There are reading lists that are being curated at schools as well for those to be resources for instructors. And to create spaces where alternate voices sit alongside canonized ones is very much an anti-racist action that is also timely and useful. So the importance of making space for perspectives that are divergent is part of that, but also so is reaching out and mentoring racialized students, creating culturally relevant and safe spaces for those who may be first from their families or communities to navigate the university environment, and specifically environment at Royal Roads, and recognize that we are learning together to build capacity and not only compile data for a prescribed research output or research or learning outcome. But for those people who are resistant, I will echo President Steenkamp's comments at the beginning that we want to call out or we want to call in instead of calling out. I think that's probably the more productive way of moving forward personally. But for those people who want to see a stratified data set or everybody on campus to answer a survey so that we can say with precision that only 3% of the Royal Roads community experiences racism, I don't think is a productive course of action. But we need to centralize and respect and listen to the voices who are expressing that this has been their experience. And we would do well to implement some sort of change within our teaching and learning and curriculum and representation of histories to include that diversity that is lacking. Those are my comments. Anyone else on the panel?
No, that was very comprehensive. Thank you.
I'll just add to the fact that part of our learning and teaching model really highlights the importance of experiential learning and really giving space for those anecdotal autoethnographic accounts. And anytime somebody does share in that way, it is doing so from a place which is personal and is vulnerable, and that we should be mindful of that as well, because it takes courage to do that. And so as people do come out and share in those ways, as we found within our focus groups, we must understand that quantitative research isn't going to necessarily be the best measure of how we extrapolate our findings, but we should actually give space and credence to those personal accounts.
Okay, so if I think we have maybe time for one or two more questions. So I'll move on to another question here, which was from Katrina, and I'll just maybe add a little to it. But I would love to hear the panel comment more on quote unquote polite racism and how to address these more subtle forms of racism that might happen in, again, quote unquote, nice academic settings. And I might just add in there, or other professional settings. And maybe if I might just ask Juli to start this one off, because I think it sort of speaks to some of the things that you were talking about in one of your previous responses.
I struggle myself with how to respond. So it's hard for me to think about how I've had those experiences, some of the things that I shared where I've had people say those specific, the totem pole thing. It just really is difficult because it like kind of took my breath away, but at the same time, working with people that I respect is like, I know they didn't mean it. So I don't know how to, like, it's hard for me. And I guess that goes back to my earlier point where it's always those racialized people that have to do that education. And so if there's more support where that conversation, like people don't realize when they say something like we should have a powwow about that actually would offend me, or that it might offend me because it is racist. They don't mean it. But the totem pole example, that's not even the way that they're constructed. Like the strongest being is actually at the bottom of the totem pole and they support the weight. So just that whole concept that the lowest person is the least important, it's just goes against everything. So it's those kinds of things though that dehumanize us in a way, that put us, that are racist towards us and pass the peace pipe. Like those aren't said in a professional setting, but the powwow thing and the totem pole thing, and I'm sure there are others. It's hard in the moment, and I don't know. So I'm not answering the question. It's difficult. I don't have an answer.
I would just like to open it up to the panel and just, again, how do you deal with these polite racism that come, like Juli suggested, perhaps from people who otherwise are just, it's just a force of habit, but they're not intending to stigmatize, but they are.
If I can, I will speak very briefly. I think that I was in both positions. We have people so many different places. So there were moments that someone called me racist because a comment that I did about one kind of people that, and it was, my first reaction was be like, no, but I am not racist. And then to realize that sometimes you can have thoughts or you can say the wrong thing at the right time, and to listen to what the person talked to you and to do your self-reflection and said, okay, what I said, it was not right. And I think that when you are in the position that you listen something is to if it is polite racism, politely speak to the person and give an answer. But to be silent, I think it's the worst option. President.
I think Julia and Alessandra have really tackled this, and it really is a moment for discussion and education, and to do it in a constructive way. So you don't need to confront people in a setting necessarily, but you can afterwards say, do you understand that term has this history or this origins or these implications? And I think you have to do it. I mean, I think it is part of your job, as if you committed to anti-racism, to do it, even if it's uncomfortable, and to address those jokes that people make too, even if they claim they're making them ironically. I think it's really important. The other thing is there's really good kind of training around things like microaggressions, implicit bias, and all of that. So I think a commitment to make sure people get that training so that they can understand some of the things that they say, which they don't think are actually racist, is important. One concept I've really been sort of challenging myself with recently is in hiring, and we use this term fit, and how important fit is as a criteria. And fit often means hiring people who look, think, and talk like you do. And I think there's another definition of fit we could be employing, which would be, people who are committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion, committed to anti-racism, committed to the kind of fundamental values of the place. So having those conversations, I think, is really important.
And just to sum up, again, thank you to our panelists. We do want to be sensitive to the time and respectful of the time, but listen more, speak less, lean into the discomfort. These are some of the sentiments that have been expressed by our panelists. And again, just to echo Julie's sentiments, none of us have lived in a decolonized Canada. And so understanding that as we walk through this will create, there will be tension. And part of this, perhaps our ethical responsibility, our moral responsibility is to actually be embracing of that challenge as we take one step at a time. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you especially to President Steenkamp for being here with us today. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Dr. Remillard.
I just will echo what Olaolu said, is the great gratitude for all of you taking the time to come out of your really busy days and sharing this important work and sharing your important perspectives and lived experiences, and I felt a real honest level of like emotional and personal sentiments being expressed, which I think is really important. And definitely in the chat, if you have a chat, the panelists go through some of the chat, you'll see some personal stories that people have shared that we haven't been able to express. So I think it really it was a great session. And again, thank you so much. We will close the session now out of respect for everyone's time, but I'm sure the conversations will continue. The room will be open because our next session is going to start up here at 12:30. That's entitled Ethical Communication in the Post-Trump Era. So panelists, if you're interested in hearing Associate Faculty Robert Remington or Dr. David Black speak on that topic later on in that session, please stick around. And thanks again for joining us, and thanks for all your great work.
Thank you.
Bye now.